You're listening to the ReasonBound Podcast, where it's not what you believe, but why that matters. Now, here's your host, Ryan Michaels.
Welcome to the ReasonBound Podcast. I am Ryan Michaels, and today I'm here with a very special person. He's been a friend of mine for around 10 years, I would say, and he is an award-winning British journalist, Mr. Charles Thomson. How's it going?
All right, thank you. How are you doing?
Another day of wine and roses. You know how it is. We go back quite a long time, and we kind of met through our interest in the Michael Jackson case, which is probably, would you say that that's your most prolific writing was done on the Michael Jackson trial?
Certainly my best known work is on Michael Jackson. I'm in quite a few books now I've been quoted in, and in particular I wrote a 5,000-word essay on the media's coverage of his trial. I wrote that on the 5-year anniversary of his acquittal, and that was 6 years ago now, 7 years ago, and every year on what the fans call Vindication Day, I still get messages from people saying that they've just read it again or they've just read it for the first time. It just seems to gain a new life every year. So yeah, that's definitely the biggest thing I've ever done.
I really, really enjoyed your writing on that. And I think I've read stuff of course, you've been writing ever since I met you. And I just hope that people will check out your work. Where's that article about the Jackson trial that you were just talking about posted? Is that on Huffington Post still?
Yeah, that's on Huffington Post. It's called One of the Most Shameful Episodes in Journalistic History. And you can find it just by typing that phrase into Google.
Yeah, it is a great, great article. I really hope people check it out. I mean, Michael Jackson is, as Quincy Jones once said, they broke the mold with him, didn't they? Kind of, you don't get much more unique in the history of probably any history, whether it's entertainment or anything else.
It's just the most incredible story you can imagine. I mean, if you wrote a novel of Michael Jackson's life, no publisher would run it because they'd say it's too ridiculous. I mean, you could take probably any single year of his life and make a biopic out of it. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I know. It's unreal. It's kind of crazy to think that we lived at the same time, but he's a whole subject unto himself. These days, do you want to talk about what you're doing?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm the chief reporter at the Yellow Advertiser newspaper series in the UK, which is one of the biggest regional newspapers in the country. We do just over 250,000 newspapers every week. So my job there is that I'm a news reporter, which involves court reporting, crime reporting, political reporting. I'm a sort of a jack of all trades. But the thing I most enjoy is the court reporting and the investigative stuff as well.
I feel like you're in the courthouse a lot. I feel like a lot of the time when I message you, you tell me that you're like, I can't talk now, Ryan. I'm taking some perp's fingerprints.
Well, I'm not taking their fingerprints, but, I am in court a lot. Just a few weeks ago, I was in a murder trial. So I do a lot of court reporting, and it is one of my favorite parts of the job.
What is it about that interests you the most?
It's difficult to say, really. I think you see all human life in the courthouse, mm-hmm. and you also see something in the courthouse that you never see anywhere else, which is it just gives you this incredible window on something that you would never normally see. I mean, I was sat in, as I say, in a murder trial a few weeks ago, and it's how many people get to sit in a courtroom, even just in their whole life, and listen to a murderer being cross-examined. It's just incredible that we all have access to that. And I just find it fascinating. I find it fascinating to listen to all the different sides of a story. I go into cases where the allegations are fabricated. I go into cases where people are guilty, and almost invariably it's just a fascinating experience. I mean, if you get in there and it's somebody that's been charged with stealing a door frame or something, then that tends to be less fascinating. But, I've been in rape trials, I've been in child abuse trials, I've been in murder cases. And
as the defendant or plaintiff?
It's just as an impartial observer, thankfully. Although I did almost get called as a witness in a fraud trial last year, but I narrowly avoided it.
In a what
gave
trial?
My witness statement. Fraud.
Oh,
it was
fraud
a politician who was charged with fraudulently claiming expenses, and they were going to call me as a defence witness because I'd actually been at the Houses of Parliament interviewing them on one of the days in question. But as it turned out, they were acquitted on the day of their trial. The judge entered a not guilty verdict, so
and you didn't want to testify?
To avoid that. I was happy to testify. I could only go in and tell the truth, and say what had happened. But I didn't relish the thought of becoming the story rather than reporting the story, to be honest. But if somebody needs me to go to court, then I'm going to go to court, because I'm very passionate about justice and everybody getting a fair trial.
Yeah, that's very, very, very important. When it comes to the concept that everyone deserves and should get a fair trial, there has been some language that I've heard a lot back in the States and more, be it on social media or even at university when I listen to a guest speaker. And kind of the topic, I guess, that we're talking about today is the presumption of innocence and why that's so important. I don't know if you can articulate why that's so important. Is there anything you want to say about that to anyone listening about why that's one of the most important things to uphold in our in Western society, or in any society it should be?
Well, I mean, everybody in their life has been accused of doing something that they haven't done, even if it's just when you're a kid and, say one of your siblings will pretend that you've hit them, run to your mum and say, he just hit me, and then start pretending to cry, and then you get told off.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. So I remember being at school one time, and there was this kid who was throwing sticks at me in the school playground. And I was with a friend of mine, and this kid, he was throwing sticks at us like the whole break time, just kept throwing sticks at us. And then we both picked up a stick each and we threw them back at this kid after it was so long he'd been throwing these sticks at us. And just as we threw these sticks back at him, one of the dinner ladies saw us. He goes, "Oi, what are you doing?" Comes over. This kid who's been pelting us with sticks the whole time starts pretending to cry and going, "Miss, they're throwing sticks at me." And so we both get taken in for the rest of the break time and made to sit in the naughty chair. And then we get told off by one of the senior staff before being marched back to our classroom after everybody else has come in. And then the teacher was taking the register, and where she would call everybody's name out, and you'd have to say, "Here, miss." And then she said my name, and I said, "Here, miss," and she just went, "Disgrace." And then she said the next kid's name, and I just remember the fury bubbling up inside me. I knew that I really had not done anything wrong. I was just I was acting in self-defense,
right,
as it were, right?
Right.
And this kid who is the aggressor and who has caused the conflict is now masquerading as a victim, and I am being branded a disgrace. And I just remember the fury, and that was a petty incident as a kid, but the injustice of it just ate me up. I was furious. And if you can imagine then that you're older, that you're an adult, and you are not being accused of throwing a stick at someone, you're being accused of raping someone or abusing a child, something that in wider society, it's the worst thing you can be accused of.
Right.
You'll be, people will be disgusted by you. And they will want to hurt you and shun you and so on. And knowing that it's not true, knowing that everybody hates you and everybody thinks you've done this disgusting, evil thing, and you know you haven't, and how incredibly frustrating that must be. I just can't really think of anything worse other than then being convicted of it and having to go to prison and being surrounded by people who do that kind of thing and being stuck there. It's just so difficult to imagine that happening. And any system that we can put in place to protect an innocent person from that situation is vital and must be protected and defended at all costs, really, I think. There's an old saying that it's better that 10 guilty men walk free than one innocent man spends his life in prison.
Yeah.
And I do believe that. I
do too. Absolutely. And that's why it today we're going to be talking about some cases involving rape and sexual assault and some really, some really brutal stuff. But there's nothing more important, I agree with you, than the presumption of innocence. And because talk about the ultimate injustice to send someone to prison for rape when they haven't done it, for example, because then when it comes out that it wasn't true, then you've really undermined your own credibility. It'll pretty soon it'll become like the boy who cried wolf. So, it protects both, doesn't it? If we just started, haphazardly sending people away, and then it turns out that all these people were sent away and they didn't do it and, whatever else, then you'd think that people will be even more skeptical to believe the alleged victim the next time around.
Yeah, and it's kind of something that we're seeing in politics and society at the moment in the UK and America, which is that people are becoming increasingly skeptical of the establishment and of authority.
Yeah.
And that's why you've got these kind of nihilistic, crazy things happening, like people voting a lunatic into the presidential office and people in the UK voting to extract themselves from this incredibly protective political union and basically, expel themselves onto this little powerless island and then destroy their economy. It's and anything that we can do to kind of stop this weird sort of rejection of everything that exists in the Western world at the moment, which is just plunging us into this crazy situation. So you don't want to undermine the system. You want the system, in terms of the legal system, it absolutely needs to be protected. And, the presumption of innocence. And I just can't think of anything worse. I just can't think of anything worse than everybody thinking you did this evil thing and you didn't do it and nobody believes you. It's like a nightmare.
What about the people?
Except you'd never be able to wake up from it.
What about the people who will say, well, but only a small percentage, for example, of women lie about being, and I've heard some people say it never happens, but at least slightly more reasonable people will say, well, it's such a small percentage, so therefore we should I've seen people screaming on social media in all caps, you always believe the victim, you always. I'm thinking, well, but we have to determine that there was a victim in the first place, and that's akin to just becoming the devil incarnate right then and there, suggesting that, that we should go through due process. And the thing with me is, if someone makes an accusation like that, that's one of the most serious things in the world, like you said. And so you take it seriously. You don't have to disbelieve the person either. You can say, and I guess too, if you know the person, you'll have more of a personal idea as to whether this is likely true or likely untrue. But for me, like if I'm a counselor in a school and someone comes in and tells me whether it's a guy or girl that they've been raped, I'm taking it real seriously. I'm taking the accusation seriously. I'm making it known to them that I'm taking it seriously. But I'm not gonna go out and start whistling for the mob to come out with pitchforks until, we've gone through due process and had a trial and everything else. I mean, you can't, because you just don't know for sure. That's the whole reason that we have trials, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, saying it's such a small percentage of people that make it up. Well, how many allegations are there a year? I mean, it's got to be
Right.
tens of thousands, so even a small percentage is a large number of people that have been falsely accused. And that is the point of a trial. The point of a trial is to test the evidence, and if somebody's making it up, or if it's a dubious case, then you acquit, and that doesn't mean that if somebody is obviously guilty, then you're going to let them go.
Right.
But, I mean, that's kind of, and a lot of this is framed, I think, by media, not necessarily news media, but if you watch, say, cop dramas, things like that, they always present the guilty as obviously guilty and the victims as being obviously victims.
Yeah.
And they kind of, in most cases, like I love Law and Order, right, the TV show. I know it's cheesy, but I love it. And they always present the villain as this kind of snarling, evil, sort of megalomaniac, sort of running rings around the system, using an expensive, fancy lawyer to get themselves off the hook when they're obviously guilty on some technicality or whatever. That's not really an accurate representation. I mean, I'm sure it does happen once in a blue moon, but most criminals, most rapists are not going to walk out of the building and say to the detective, I am guilty, but you're never going to prove it. It's just a kind of a ludicrous, cartoonish portrayal. But that kind of portrayal of the legal system, of reasonable doubt and due process being obstacles to justice. Now, reasonable doubt and due process are justice.
Right.
They define justice, but the media portrays them as obstacles to justice. It's kind of like you find yourself sympathizing with these detectives who are going, he's obviously guilty, but just because there's no evidence at all that he did it, it means we can't shoot him. And that's kind of,
Right.
and you're on the detective side because that's the way the program's been constructed, and they're showing you this stuff which demonstrates that he's obviously guilty, but he's just clever.
Do they do that because the catharsis is so much greater for the viewer if they think it's because a lot of people, like you said, have lost faith in the system. So then if on Law and Order or whatever, they have some like rapist like skip out of the courtroom, go up to the copper and say, you'll never catch me. Like when they finally get their comeuppance, the viewer's like, yes, because this really happens in real life and it makes me feel so good to see, even though it's just like fiction on television.
Well, there's an element of that. I think there's an element also of just not wanting to make things too challenging. I mean, when I come home from having worked all day, I don't really, I'm not usually in the mood at the end of the day for some kind of complex, narrative where there's all these questions and none of them ever get answered. I just want to veg out and sort of eat a chocolate bar and drink some tea and not think too hard about anything because I've been busy all day. And so they kind of paint things in these cartoonish broad strokes, I think, just because it's easier to consume. It has mass appeal. So
what you're saying is in recent years we've seen the result of crime dramas realizing they have to compete with Ren and Stimpy.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, and you're starting to see I think you're seeing society starting to view the justice system as being like the justice system that they see on their televisions when it really isn't. Because people don't go to court anymore, and everybody has a right to go to court. If you live in Britain or if you live in America, you have a right to go and sit in a courtroom. You can go and sit in any case that you want to sit in. Unless the judge has made an order that you can't for some reason, for this national security or something. But, you could go down to your local courthouse tomorrow morning. You can sit in a case, and I would encourage you to do so because you'll gain a better understanding of the way the justice system really works rather than this cartoonish portrayal on TV, which basically misleads people, I think, into thinking that it's all, a guilty person's charter and that it exists to penalize the innocent.
Absolutely. When I lived in Oregon, still, because now I'm in Tokyo, but last year I had some friends who are international students come to Oregon, and one of my Japanese friends is majoring in law, and he wanted to go to the courthouse in America, and so I took him and we went to the courthouse, and we sat in on a murder trial, and it was really, really fascinating because, like you said, it wasn't at all like what you see on TV and the dramas. It was very real, very emotional. Like you said, the stuff that you just don't see anywhere else when it comes to human emotion except for in a courtroom. And that was only one day, that we were there. But it was powerful stuff, and I really hope that everyone does do it at some point. Keeping in line with the presumption of innocence, the number one time when I hear this questioned and even hear people advocating that we abolish the presumption of innocence is oftentimes when it comes to rape cases. There was a man who came to my university, I want to say 2013, and our professor was going to give us extra credit if we went and wrote a paper about it. And so I went and I listened to him and I wrote the type of paper that I knew they wanted to hear, and I got full points for it. And I was listening to this guy, and his name is Dr. Jackson Katz. From his Wikipedia page, just to give a brief introduction to who he is for anyone who doesn't know. It says Jackson T. Katz is an American educator, filmmaker, and author. He is a creator of a gender violence prevention and education program entitled Mentors in Violence Prevention, which has been actively marketed to the U.S. military and various sporting organizations. Katz's work centers on violence, media, and masculinities with an added focus on media literacy. He has made several documentaries on the representation of women and men in media. Some of what he was saying I thought was interesting. Obviously all decent people obviously want to cut down sexual assault and sexual violence as much as possible, want to make it non-existent if we could. But some of what this guy was saying I thought was a little strange. Well, I thought was a lot strange. And I remember when I was listening to him, he seemed to be advocating abolishing the presumption of innocence. So he never came right out and said it. And so I was kind of interested in what I was hearing from this guy. And so I started, looking up things he'd written and in interviews, and he's done a TED Talk and stuff. And before we did this podcast, I was just kind of reading up on him again. And I wanted to get your opinion on just a few blurbs that he's written. He's also written for the Huffington Post, so although I like your pieces better. But
Thank you.
He doesn't like referring to someone as an accuser. And from one of his articles on the Huffington Post that's titled DSK's alleged victim should not be called his accuser in quotes, he wrote, "When media coverage sets up a binary opposition between, quote, the accuser and, quote, the accused, there is no longer a victim or even an alleged victim, a flesh and blood person who was harmed by the violent act of another." Now, just right there's some problems I have with his language when he says there's no longer a victim. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know that there ever was a victim to begin with, so how can you say there no longer was one, And just when he talks about this type of thing, and when it seems like his take is that if someone's accused, just they're guilty. That's all there is to it. And he'll also write in that same train of thought that when you say, for example, let's say it's a woman who's accusing a man of rape, he'll say that it's problematic because if you refer to the woman as the accuser, now you're changing it into something that she is doing to him. Like now that it somehow makes him look like the victim because she is his accuser. And that's certainly not the way my mind works. I don't know if that's the way Dr. Jackson Katz's mind works, but when I hear accuser, I think, okay, this is someone who they've possibly had something horrible happen to them, and they're trying to get what they hopefully sincerely believe is justice, again, if they were really a victim. Anyway, how do you feel about that, not referring to people as accusers, but calling them victims, and he'll say that he'll compromise by referring to them as an alleged victim, as if that's a compromise. I mean, that's the most reasonable thing in the world. They are an alleged victim, just like there's an alleged perpetrator. But anyway, how do you feel about that?
The idea that you should refer to somebody as the victim, if the whole point of the trial is to ascertain whether they're telling the truth or not, is madness. You clearly should not refer to them as the victim, and it's just a matter of accuracy. It's just a matter of factual accuracy. If the person has not yet been convicted, then the crime has not yet been proven to have taken place, and therefore there is no technical victim yet. Now, there could be an instance where victim would be appropriate, and that would be, for instance, if the defense conceded that there had been a rape, but disputed that their client was the rapist, then it might be acceptable to use the word victim. But there's nothing pejorative about using the word accuser.
Do you buy his argument about that it then paints the woman in this hypothetical? Yeah, I don't either. I think it's a bizarre.
I think that's just, I find it very strange and sort of extremist in a way. It just seems to be part of this ongoing push by certain factions to stack the system even more against the accused than it already is, and to effectively pave the way for the removal of the presumption of innocence. That's what it sounds like to me.
He goes on to say that, it's designed to portray it as no flesh and blood victim. Well, we don't know that there is one yet until there's been a trial and due process, but only an accuser facing off against the accused, right? And
he also, just to jump in, I think he's also overthinking things here. When I'm writing a news story about a trial, I am not in a million years thinking about whether the language I'm using is portraying a flesh and blood person, blah blah. I mean, that's just this is the problem where academics start concerning themselves with journalism. They don't really know what they're talking about, to be perfectly honest. I mean, my job is to communicate the facts, and the fact is person A is accusing person B of doing offence X, and person B denies doing offence X. And so in that scenario, is it factually accurate to refer to person A as the accuser? Yes. Is it also factually accurate to refer to them as the alleged victim? Yes. Now, if I'm writing a 1,000-word story where I'm going to have to refer 20 times to the same person, I'm not going to say the alleged victim every time because it's boring. So I'm also going to change the words that I use to stop people from thinking that I'm a terrible writer. So I might, on one occasion, I might call them the accuser. In the next line, I might call them the alleged victim. In the next line, I might say the woman said. In the next line, I might say the defendant. And then later, I might refer to the defendant as the accused, or whatever. So it's not this over-analysis of media. I see it all the time. It's just bullshit. It's just navel-gazing, pretentious bullshit. No news reporter is making these kind of decisions when they're writing a news story. It's just it's lunacy. It's like conspiracy theory. Well, the media's conspiring to portray her as... No, it's not that. You don't know what you're talking about. Go away. That's my answer.
He goes on to say in that article that I referenced earlier that when you talk about the accuser and the accused, that the terms of the debate shift away from, quote, what happened or didn't happen in the hotel room or wherever else rapes might take place, and onto the credibility of the two parties. Well, aren't we supposed to be evaluating the credibility of the two parties?
Yeah, the whole point of a trial. See, this is another area where things are shifting, is that people are almost starting to see the legal system as some sort of support system for people that say they've been victims of crime. It's not. The legal system is designed to test evidence and make a decision about facts, about what happened or what didn't happen, or whether it can be proved that something happened or didn't happen. The legal system is not there to support victims. There are plenty of other organizations that exist that do fantastic work that are there to support victims. Many times they work in tandem with the legal system, witness support services, etc. But the legal system's job is to hear the facts in a very clinical way and then to ask a panel of impartial individuals to go away and analyze those facts and the evidence and make a decision about what they think did or did not happen. It's not supposed to be an emotional decision. the judge instructs the jury that it's not supposed to be an emotional decision. And my job as a reporter is also to treat the public as if they were the jury. Because as I said earlier, the courtroom is open to the public. Anybody in the public can go and sit in that courtroom and listen to that case. Most of them won't do that because A, there aren't enough seats, B, they're at work, or they're looking after their kids, or whatever. But they have an absolute right to know anything that goes on in any courtroom in this country. Absolute right. They're paying for it.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
They pay for the courtroom, they pay for the judge, they pay for the prosecutor. Many cases, if the defendant is not a person of means, then they're paying for the defender as well. They're paying for the witness support service. They're paying for everything. And it's all being done in their name. A trial is held in the public interest. Laws exist in the public interest to protect the public. So, for instance, it's in the public interest to have a law that says you're not allowed to rape people because that protects the public from being raped. Ergo, when somebody is prosecuted for allegedly raping someone, that is being done in the public interest using public money in a public courtroom. So the public has an absolute right to know what's going on in that courtroom. So this idea that that I'm infusing the article with language that's designed to blah, 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 it's just drivel. Often that report has been written in 5 minutes in a rush. I've been in court all day. I need to get something written. And so I just write it, and that's it. When academics concern themselves with journalism, they assume that journalists agonize over every word in the same way that an academic does. My job is to succinctly relay information in a factual way. It's not to, agonize over subtexts.
Your point about the court system not being there as a support for victims is, I don't think that can be overstated. And that's such a good point. And I think people need to remember that. It's there to find, the point is to find truth, right? We're not going to do anything as far as we can help it that'll bias the proceedings because we want to find out what the truth is of what happened. There's 2 more points that Katz brought up that I really want to ask you about. And the next one is he ends with a question. I'll read this little section that he wrote, and then I'll let you answer his question. He's talking about, again, when you refer to the 2 parties as the accuser and the accused, that it helps fuel the idea amongst the public that it's all a matter of he said, she said. And then he says, quote, "But it's not. The person who reports a rape is only the first player in a chain of events and decisions ultimately made by police and prosecutors in relatively rare instances, juries. Ms. Diallo reported that she had been sexually assaulted, but she's not the one who brought the charges. That's what the district attorney did after weighing the available evidence that a crime was committed. By bringing charges, the DA in effect accused the suspect of committing a criminal offense. So why don't we call Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus R. Vance Jr. DSK's accuser? Why don't we, Charlie?"
Well, we don't do that because why would we do that? Again, this is just silly academic twaddle. We call the district attorney because they are the district attorney. We call the accuser because we're not allowed to use their name. So we have to figure out these code words. Well, not code words, but we have to think of ways to refer to the alleged victim or the complainant or the accuser, or whatever you want to call them, usually all 3 in the space of one story, because they are granted anonymity in the proceedings.
What about in America, where I think we can use their names?
I think it's at the judge's discretion in America. Now, I'm not 100%, but I know, for instance, that in the Jackson case, the judge had the option of referring to the family as Doe, Jane Doe, John Doe, etc., and banning the press from using their names. But because they had already appeared in the media, most notably the boy and the siblings had appeared in the Living with Michael Jackson, Martin Bashir documentary, and then in the rebuttal, the Michael Jackson Take 2 thing, there was no logical reason why their names should be blanked out because everybody already knew who they were. But, in the UK, we grant immediate anonymity to anybody who makes an accusation of rape or something like that, and unless they choose to waive their anonymity, then that remains in place.
And you have to establish their relationship to the case, because the name doesn't tell you we know what the relationship is when you say district attorney. We know what that person's relationship is to the court proceedings. So we have to establish what the relationship is when we start talking about Jane and John, or we don't know who's accusing who. So.
Yeah, it just irritates me with this kind of academic whinging, because it just demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of what the job of a reporter is, which is to convey the information succinctly. When you're trying to reduce 4 hours testimony or 6 hours testimony into a news story and remain as accurate as possible, you have to use shorthands. You can't publish a transcript because that would fill the newspaper from cover to cover. So how do you boil this down? Or you just say the accuser, because now everybody who's reading that story knows exactly what you're talking about. It's that simple.
This is how confused Katz is. This is the last thing I wanted to ask you about. He says in the end of his article that there's a solution to the misuse of the term accuser, which it's not misused in the first place. He just he just asserts a lot of things in here, and he just assumes that people will accept his premises, which I guess maybe university students do. But even when I was listening to him, I thought some of what this guy's saying, he doesn't sound like he's totally there. But he'll say the solution to the non-problem that he thinks is a problem is simple. Refer to the complaining witness in a rape case as the victim. A compromise strategy is to use the term alleged victim, although, as many rape victim advocates point out, victims who report other crimes are rarely questioned about whether or not they were victimized. I read that last sentence and I thought I don't know if that's true. Is that true? I mean, it just seems like a weird assertion, again, because he makes a bunch of assertions, and I'm like, I don't even know if that's true, because I started thinking about any instances I know where someone's accused someone of stealing or something, and I'm like, no, I think I think there's always questioning, isn't there?
Well, it probably is more prevalent in cases of alleged sexual abuse, because they are often cases where there is no third-party evidence.
Right, exactly.
So if there's been a burglary and somebody's on trial for burglary and their house has been broken into, there will be evidence that the house has been broken into. There will be a smashed window, there'll be a door that's been smashed open, there will be items that were in the house that are no longer in the house, so
right.
It's quite clear that there is a crime that has been committed. Similarly, if somebody has had the tires stolen from their car, then there will be evidence, namely the car sitting in the driveway with no tires on it, but when you've got an allegation of a crime against a person, you are left in a situation where it is one word against another.
The only last thing I wanted to say on Jackson Katz is, to be fair, and that just to close out that article, he does say at towards the end of the article that if you use alleged victim, it says it treats the man or woman with respect, and he says, quote, and it crucially preserves the presumption of innocence for the alleged perpetrator. And to me, it's just weird that he'll throw that in at the end, because he knows that what he's written so far, because just in the preceding paragraph, he says, yeah, it's a simple solution. Just refer to the complaining witness as the victim. He knows that this is bogus and bullshit. And so at the very end, he's just saying, oh, it's so crucial to preserve the presumption of innocence, because he's kind of like under a thin veil tried to deconstruct that through his entire piece. And then at the end, he's just doing that, I think, to protect himself.
I mean, does he get paid to write this, or is this like a hobby? I don't really understand what the point of this is. This just sounds like the ravings of a madman to me. I mean, to say that we should refer to somebody as the victim when it has not been established as a matter of fact that there is a crime is just crazy.
He said kind of weird things about he'll say that violence against, now this, I'm not saying the first part of this is weird. He'll say violence against women isn't a women's issue, it's a men's issue. I'm like, well, is it one or the other?
Well, it depends.
It does
what
depend.
If the woman has been beaten up by another woman?
Right. And he'll say that it's men's responsibilities to, and not just men who are rapists, but just men in general, just men. And I can't figure out if he's just trying to get brownie points from his audience in his own echo chamber or what, but I don't fully know what unless he's assuming that most men are just standing around if they see a rape and there's, oh, look at that.
Oh yeah, look, there's a rape going on. I mean,
I just wish that I wish people would stop pretending that we need Anderson Cooper to come on the television and tell all of us that raping is uncouth. Like, I think we all know that. Or we should know
exactly.
It.
It's like, silliness. As if you're going to walk down the street and see a man punching a woman in the face and you're not going to do anything about it. To say that this is all men's issue, like we're all sitting around on our hands watching women get beaten up and raped every day as just crackers. I don't really, again, I see, in journalism there are lots of academics. It must be close to a decade ago. I went to a seminar called The Future of Journalism or something, and there was this guy who was one of the speakers, the keynote speakers, is this little skinny sort of 5'2" guy with a big mane of like ginger ringlets. I just don't remember his name. But he basically came on stage and said, within 2 years, there will be no newspapers. They will all be dead. And, of course, here we are a decade later and still plenty of newspapers around. Academics just seem to me to get paid to talk shit. I don't really understand who's paying them or why they're getting paid, but I just don't really put any stock in anything they say about anything. It's a kind of a cliche, but they just do seem to be people that sit in offices imagining what must be going on in the real world. I mean, a lot of the stuff you're reading from Dr. Katz is just...
He'll also say things, and I've heard this echoed too, and I think it's kind of dangerous, some of what he says. He'll say that people should not teach women, you shouldn't teach a woman how not to get raped. In other words, like if I had a daughter, okay, I'd say, honey, you should be able to leave the house at 9:00 p.m. and walk to your friend's house in darkness wearing the shortest skirt you want. You should be able to, but unfortunately, no fault of your own, there's a lot of sickos out there, and you want to be a little careful, and you want to not attract sickos. I mean, and I'm not, again, that's not saying that you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's just like, I should be able to walk down some, like, inner city street in a jacket made out of $100 bills, okay? But if I do that, there's some chance that that's not the optimal way for me to successfully walk through the inner city streets without getting beaten up and robbed, right? So now I should be able to do that, but because that's my choice, but it's not the smart thing for me to do. If I had a daughter and I tell her, if you want to go to some party and you want to dress sexy, whatever, granted she's at an age where I'm not, like maybe that's closer to 16, 17, right? I'd say go with a group, just fine, but just go with a group of friends. I don't want you walking down some dark street alone, dressed all, pretty for a party. I just don't, because I want you to be protected. And it's not that it's immoral for you to do it. It's just that I'm worried about you, and I don't want you to be I want you to be safe. That's my motivation. Well, but he will say, just to finish my point real quick, he'll say, don't teach women, and people like him will say, don't teach women not to get raped. Teach men not to rape. And the idea is that there's all these men that would otherwise look at this girl and just go and attack her and rape her, or at the party just wait for their chance to rape her. But when they hear Dr. Jackson Katz, if they can hear him first say, hey, that's wrong, they'll say, oh, geez, well, I was going to rape this girl that I saw walking down the street, but I just heard Dr. Jackson Katz do a TED Talk where he says I shouldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is just academia all over. I mean, just what is the point of this shit? But there was a story about a year or 2 years ago where somebody had developed a nail polish for women where
the date rape nail polish.
Yeah, they put the nail polish, they put their finger in their drink, and if their drink has been spiked, it will tell them because the nail polish will change color. And there was this kind of a huge, crazy backlash from the feminist brigade saying, this is a disgrace. You're blaming women for getting raped. And it's like, how have you made this leap? If I put a burglar alarm on my house, well, let's say I don't put a burglar alarm on my house, and the next house along does have a burglar alarm, and then I get burgled, then it's not my fault that I've been burgled. I didn't deserve to get burgled.
Right.
But I could have taken a precaution which might have stopped me getting burgled. Nobody's saying,
but that's
it's
victim
a woman's
blaming.
job.
They'll say,
Yeah,
oh, you're victim blaming.
Apparently taking precautions is victim blaming. That's okay. If you don't want to use the nail polish, don't use the nail polish. But, if a woman wants to use the nail polish and then it saves her from getting raped, then it's almost like they're saying that woman's in the wrong. I don't understand what they're saying. If that nail polish saves one woman from getting raped, what are you complaining about? I don't get it.
If I walk down the inner city street in a jacket made of $100 bills and I get beaten up and robbed, and you tell me that next time I shouldn't walk down the inner city street in a jacket made out of money, I'm going to tell you, you know what, award-winning journalist Charles Thomson, you know what? Don't tell me not to be the victim of robbery. Go down to the inner city and tell them not to be robbers.
Well, yeah, good luck with that.
Right.
Is all I'm saying. We'll put all the robbers in a classroom. We'll say, this is why you shouldn't rob people. Number one, it's very upsetting if you get robbed. Very, very upsetting. Number two, it's illegal. Shouldn't do things that are illegal, should we? No. Okay. Number three, people won't like you. They'll say, oh, he's a robber. Don't like him. Number four, as if they're going to walk out of the classroom and go, oh, my life has been changed.
Yeah.
I'm going to go and become a Wall Street banker or something.
Yeah.
It's just stupidity.
Well, if they become a Wall Street banker, they haven't listened very carefully to your lecture on not robbing people.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, that was a bad example. I'm going to go and become a police officer. That's absolutely changed my perspective.
Yeah.
I didn't realise that it's not nice when you get robbed. Now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Oh, what have I been doing all this time?
Yeah, it's very, very strange.
Yeah, it's stupidity.
Yeah, it is.
If you can give people an extra precaution and they want to use it, then what is the issue, really?
Well, Dr. Katz, I sure hope you're listening. That's all I can say.
I'd love to know who's paying them and where they're getting their money from.
Yeah.
If you want to pay me like $50,000 a year to just make shit up, go for it.
Yeah. Put words that are perfectly acceptable under a microscope until you can find some way they're problematic and write masturbatory blog posts all about how they need to be changed. And I just want to be really, really clear to people who are listening. First of all, Charlie and I take any kind of sexual violence, whether it's against women or men, very, very seriously. Okay. But we're addressing this because this does not make sense. Okay. It just does not it's not rational.
Well,
it's not logical.
Listen, I've sat in courtrooms with women who have been abused. Okay. I've sat and watched them give evidence in a trial. It's the most horrifying, distressing thing you can imagine. It's not nice. It's the worst part of my job because it's just really traumatic for them, and to watch it, it just crushes you, absolutely crushes you. You want to burst out crying. It's awful. But does that mean that the test, which protects innocent people, should be removed? No, it doesn't, because it would be just as horrifying to send somebody to prison when they've not done something as it is to do something to a woman. Where do we draw so it's more acceptable to send somebody to a prison full of lunatics when they've not done anything wrong? It's any kind of offence against a person is horrendous, but the test must be preserved. It must be protected, because that test protects innocent people from being violated, just as the law protects innocent people from being violated.
Yeah, and it's in just, it doesn't make any sense to ask strangers who don't know either person in a case like this to decide that one of them's the victim and one of them is the perpetrator, because we don't know these people. If my best friend told me that she was raped, I would believe her. As sure as I could be about anything, because I know that she's a trustworthy person, I would be 99.99999, but that still doesn't, I can't go get the lynch mob. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the only way that gets taken away from you is if it's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you have done something to, that you're a danger to society. So, if you know someone, obviously you can. I'm not saying be skeptical if it's your best friend and you know them and they tell you they were raped. Obviously, if it's someone you know, you're gonna have a really good idea if they're telling if what they're saying is accurate or not. So.
And that works both ways, to be honest. Oftentimes when a story is not true, you will see that the people around that person know in advance that it's not true. You can see that they know this is a person who's not necessarily to be relied. Look at the, I know we keep coming back to it, but look at the Jackson case with that family of accusers where the defense was able to just call this seemingly endless list of people to come in and say, well, yeah, they ripped me off, they falsely accused me of something, they did this, it was just this litany of...
She'd accused sexual assault before. I think that was with J.C. Penney, wasn't it?
Yeah, welfare fraud, the J.C. Penney case. Yeah, there was just this, they'd accused their own dad, they had accused the comedian George Lopez of stealing their wallet. They'd done all kinds of stuff to all sorts of people. They'd run fundraisers to pay for the kids' cancer when it turned out they already had medical insurance, so they were just pocketing the money.
Oh, yeah.
They'd done all kinds of, So in the same way that if it's your best friend, you'll have a good idea, when it's a false accusation, people often also have a good idea.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, usually the better you know someone, the better idea you'll have as to whether or not what they're saying is true or not. Just the type of language and the type of thing that Katz and some people on the left are advocating in at least some of their speech and some of their writing, it's really dangerous. You should never look at someone without evidence and without cause and determine that they're a rapist or that they're a criminal of some sort. If it ever happened, I said this the other night when I was talking to people, if someone like Katz, and I'm not saying he's this extreme, because again, he threw that little nugget in at the end of his article about how it's so crucial to preserve the presumption of innocence. But if there was some guy or some whoever was leading the charge and they were ever one day successful, they won't be. But if they were ever successful one day in getting rid of the presumption of innocence, they're the first person I'm going to accuse of raping me. I'm going to do it the very next day. I'm like, yeah, oh yeah, this person raped me, lock him up. Live by the sword, die by the sword type of thing. So. Anyway, there's a few cases that I wanted to speak with you about to provide some context for people who I hope are listening to this, who just assume maybe they've heard. There's all kinds of propaganda about this issue from certain voices on the left. I've even heard people claim that, not credible people most likely, but I've seen it on social media, that no one ever lies about this. And even though, would you say it's fair to say that in general people don't lie about these types of accusations, or do you have any insight to that?
I don't sit in court and watch every case, so I couldn't give an opinion as to the percentage of cases that are right or, that are just or unjust, but I certainly have sat in multiple cases personally where it has become apparent that the accuser was not telling the truth. There was one case, which I remember very clearly, where the girl had accused her mother's boyfriend of abusing her. What it turned out, the evidence showed overwhelmingly, was that she had disliked her mother's new boyfriend and had devised a scheme to get rid of him. She was a minor, but she was just a minor. She was about 15. And what she'd done was she'd sat in the lounge with the boyfriend, watching TV while the mum was out. And then when she heard the mum put her key in the front door and walk through the door, this girl jumped out of her seat and went and sat on the lap of the mother's boyfriend. And, just as she did that, before the guy even had a chance to react, the mum walks past the door to the lounge and sees her daughter sat in this guy's lap with her arms around his neck. And he's looking at the mum going, don't ask me, I don't know what's going on. And the girl sort of jumps up as if she's been caught doing something she shouldn't. And then there's a big argument, and then later the girl goes and tells her mum, oh yeah, we've been sleeping together for however long. And it was just this purely...
Sociopath.
It was, purely malicious, and the guy was acquitted. There was no question. I mean, the evidence was overwhelming, and her cross-examination was, atrocious. I mean, she just crumbled. And there was another case that I saw where it was a boy, again, who was just underage. He was 15, going on 16.
And also to be clear for listeners, when you say just underage, the age of consent in the UK is 16.
Is 16, yeah, both, just blanket 16, yeah. This was a case with a 15-year-old gay boy who was on a gay dating website, or was on gay dating websites, I should say. Actually, this meeting occurred through Facebook. He adds this guy on Facebook. I forget how they came to add each other. They had some mutual friends. And the boy doesn't have his age listed on his profile. He gets in touch with this guy, starts chatting him up, and the guy says, do you want to meet up? And the kid, going along with it, yeah, that would be great, blah, blah. They meet up, and he tells the guy, he says, by the way, I'm underage. And the guy totally freaks out. He's going, oh my God, why didn't you tell me? And they're driving around in his car at this point. And the guy that he's met, this kid has met this guy, and he's I know I keep saying this kid and this guy, that's because I don't want to give the names for obvious reasons. So he discovers when he meets this guy that he's a bit older than he looked, and he's balding, and he's not really interested anymore. And then somebody he knows from school rides past them on a bike and sees them, he thinks, through the car windscreen. And so he's going, oh shit, he says to the guy, that guy, I know him from school, now he's going to know that I've been out with you, this is terrible. So anyway, he drops the kid back off and then drives home. And then he gets a text from this kid that says, I need you to delete all of the messages between us on Facebook. And the guy doesn't do it, but the kid does. And then what he does is, because he's so worried that this kid from school has seen him in a car with this older man, and he's going to put it about school, this kid likes going out with older men, you should have seen him, he was with this bald old man, blah, blah, blah. He decides to get his story in first. And so he rings up his friend and says, I've been raped by this older man. He told me he was much younger, and I met him in his car, and then he raped me. And then the best friend contacts the parents, and then the parents talk to the kid, and he says, oh yeah, it's true, I was raped by this older man. Police are called. Anyway, so what happens is, when it comes to trial, the police prosecute. Why they prosecuted, I don't even know, to be honest, because the evidence was so thin. But the guy did not delete all of the Facebook messages like the kid had told him to. So when it comes to court, he's able to prove that almost everything this kid is saying about their first interactions is just bullshit. He's saying, oh, the guy told me he was only 25, and then when I met him he was more like 45. Didn't happen. So on and so forth. And so the guy was acquitted. So, that's just two examples of cases that I've sat in where the evidence has demonstrated overwhelmingly that the allegations were fabricated. In one case, purely malicious. In the other case, a face-saving exercise.
Yeah, and that shows that there's more than one reason for why someone might do it. Like you said, face-saving exercise.
They can do it for all kind of
sociopath.
reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, sometimes it's just because they're attention seekers. Sometimes it's because there's something wrong with them. Sometimes they have been abused by someone else, but they decide to take it out on an innocent person. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why people fabricate these allegations. And it's the interesting thing, actually, is that you mentioned that quote by the doctor about nobody else who's accused of, nobody else who suffers a crime has their victimhood questioned.
He said, as many rape victim advocates point out, victims who report other crimes are rarely questioned about whether or not they were victimized.
Well, similarly, people who question the guilt of people who've committed other crimes are not questioned in the same way as people who question the guilt of somebody who's been convicted of a sex offense. So if somebody is convicted of a robbery, and then you start raising questions as to whether they are actually innocent, you don't get accused of being a robbery sympathizer. And even with murderers, there are very often people who start campaigns to get convicted murderers a new trial because they believe they're innocent. They don't get accused of being murder sympathizers. But
it's a good point.
Anybody that questions the guilt of somebody who's been accused or convicted of rape or child abuse, they immediately, by certain factions, are accused of being a rape sympathizer or a rape apologist or a paedophile sympathizer or whatever. There's a book by a journalist called Dorothy Rabinowitz. She wrote a book called No Crueler Tyrannies, and it was a whole book she wrote about people who've been falsely accused and convicted of child abuse. And she wrote in the introduction to the book, she said, "I have to note the query often raised in the course of interviews about these cases. Did I recognize that child sex abuse existed and was a serious problem?" reporters would ask. A strange question that. The discussion of no other crime would require such a disclaimer.
Right.
Journalists who have written about false murder charges are seldom asked to provide reassurances that they know that murder is a bad thing and that it really happens. So there is this kind of strange phenomenon where anybody who questions a sex offense or somebody who accuses somebody of a sex offense is immediately accused of being an apologist or a sympathizer. And you're simply applying the same evidential test as you would to any other crime. And certainly when I wrote that article about the Michael Jackson trial, there were people on these strange, obscure internet forums who started accusing me of being a paedophile sympathizer. And then they went to these very extreme lengths where they were setting up email addresses that looked like mine. So, for instance, let's say my email address is like beaniebaby1@hotmail.com. They were setting up beaniebaby1@yahoo.com, beaniebaby1@gmail.com, beaniebaby1@whatever, googlemail.com. And then they were using these email addresses that were modeled on mine to go onto these obscure forums and start asking for child porn and stuff.
Oh, I remember that.
It was absolutely horrifying, and I almost had like a nervous breakdown about it. It was just, because, people would Google my name, and then this would come up. It was like, oh my God. So there's this really strange attitude people have, to sex offenses, where if you question any other crime, it's fine. But if you apply the same evidential test that you would to a murder or a burglary or a robbery or something else, if you apply that same evidential test to a sex offense, an alleged sex offense, you just become this pariah.
So the Michael Jackson trial is, I feel, so misunderstood. I mean, that aspect of his life, I feel to this day, there's just been so much garbage. I think part of it is he's the most covered human being on the planet. and there's just so much misinformation out there. Sometime, I suppose we could do if you want, we could do a whole podcast just all about that. Have you ever done that before? Have you ever gone through kind of like the beginning through the end of the Michael Jackson trial?
Never, no, but it would be interesting to do that.
Almost no one was reason-bound when it came to discussing that case, so sometime that'd be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah.
I guess the last part of this podcast that I wanted to talk to you about, there are some pretty famous cases that really demonstrate why the presumption of innocence is so important. Probably the case that most people are aware of, at least in recent times, is the one involving Nate Parker. And there's been some controversy about the Oscars this year. Do you want to fill everyone in on Nate Parker and what's been going on with that?
So in 1999, Nate Parker is a student, and he and his friend, Jean Celestin, are accused of raping a woman. And they claim that the woman consented, but she says that she was drunk and that she does not recall consenting, and that she does not believe that she was coherent enough to have consented. They stand trial, and Nate Parker is acquitted, and Celestin is convicted, but in a subsequent proceeding, he too is acquitted. Parker goes on to have quite a successful career in television. Then a couple of years ago, he starts writing this movie, which is based on a true story of a slave uprising in America. He writes and produces this film himself, directs it, finds the funding himself, and stars in it. And it becomes like the talk of the festival circuit. It's tipped for massive award success. It's an early frontrunner for the Oscars.
And that's Birth of a Nation?
Birth of a Nation. And this was doing the festival circuit late last year, and it was, really going gangbusters. Everybody was loving it. Then, for some reason, his rape trial comes back to the forefront. And I believe it was because the alleged victim's sister wrote an article in Variety, and in that article, she is saying he is a rapist. Even though he's been acquitted, she's saying he is a rapist. And all of a sudden, there's this kind of growing demand for him to issue an apology. It turns out that the lady who accused him has taken her own life in the interim in 2012, I believe. And this is where you start seeing this switch where the left wing, which 20 years ago would have been on the side of the wrongly accused, now, because of kind of political correctness and this obsession with standing up for women and anybody who says they've been raped has been raped and so on.
Without question, right? Standing up for without question and critical thought about whether or not the
exactly
right.
Yeah, exactly. Where just immediately if somebody says they've been raped. That's it. So the left wing, which 20 years ago would have been saying, "Hang on a minute, this guy was acquitted," they're now got this kind of crazy bloodlust, and they're demanding an apology. He goes on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper and gives an interview where he says, "I'm not going to apologize." He says, "I was falsely accused. I went to court. I was vindicated. And John went to jail for something he didn't do. And he was acquitted subsequently as well." Which is perfectly reasonable. They were both acquitted. The law says that they're innocent, and that's it. And that's the only test we have. The standard is innocent until and unless proven guilty and convicted. They weren't proven guilty. Well, one of them was found guilty, but then subsequently acquitted. So they both ultimately were found to be innocent. And it's interesting because Hollywood is seen as this kind of left-wing bubble. It's often referred to as, communist, and the right wing hates Hollywood. But this supposedly left-wing bubble turns on Nate Parker. So you had actually some of the Oscars voters were saying They were refusing to even watch his film and consider it because he wouldn't apologize for a crime of which he'd been acquitted. The American Film Institute cancelled screenings of the film because he wouldn't apologize for a crime which he hadn't committed. And I actually had an exchange personally about this with Roger Friedman, the Showbiz 411 reporter on Twitter, because he was writing that this was really tanking the film, and that unless Parker apologized, he would never get the Oscar nominations that he deserves. And I tweeted Roger and I said, well, this is ridiculous. It makes a mockery of the entire ceremony because they should be voting the Oscar nominations based on the quality of the film, surely not on...
And Hollywood hasn't exactly turned their back on Roman Polanski.
Or Woody Allen.
Or Woody... Well, do we know about Woody Allen, though, for sure?
Well, no. But this is the point. Nate Parker is not guilty. Nate Parker was falsely accused. Woody Allen says he was falsely accused. Neither was ever convicted.
Nate Parker is black, isn't he?
Nate Parker is black.
Do you think that could
becomes, yeah. I was going to say there's almost nobody in the press who is defending Nate Parker, which particularly in the entertainment press. Again, it's supposedly this left-wing bubble, Hollywood. You look at the language Donald Trump was using about celebrities promoting Hillary Clinton. They're living in a fantasy world, blah blah blah. And yet nobody in the entertainment industry is really defending him. Daily Wire was one of the only places that defended him. They described it as an appalling and relentless campaign to destroy him. And they actually said that it was racist. And they used the example of Casey Affleck. Casey Affleck is nominated for the Oscar this year. And he, a few years ago, was accused by 2 women of sexual harassment, and he settled out of court. But yet he is still nominated, and his film is still being held up as a work of art, whereas Nate Parker, who was acquitted, is being made a pariah over a crime which a jury determined he'd not committed. And the interesting thing about this, actually, is that you look at who did come to Nate Parker's defense, and I was researching this today just to make sure I was remembering correctly, and I am remembering correctly that one of the only websites which took, unfortunately, given what website it is, a common sense approach, was Breitbart. And this is the kind of... I think this is...
It has switched, hasn't it?
This is symptomatic of what's going on in society generally, where you have society is moving to this kind of extreme left-wing position where you've got a guy who has been to court and has been acquitted, and despite being acquitted is being instructed that if he does not apologize for a crime which he didn't commit, then his career will be destroyed. And who is the only website, really, that stands up for him and takes a common sense approach and defends the presumption of innocence? Is Breitbart, unfortunately, and it pisses me off, but it's Breitbart, because what this does is this drives people who share that common sense opinion, it drives them to Breitbart, because they start to see that as the one website that's talking common sense.
That's been my theme since the first podcast. The left has gotten nuts, and they're driving people into the arms of the radical right. Exactly,
and it's this total switcheroo, right? So if you look by comparison at the Central Park 5 case, okay, so that's 1989. A young woman, I don't think she was a young woman, a woman was raped in Central Park and beaten so badly she's left in a coma for 2 weeks. And the police decide that this is a product of something called wilding, which is a phrase that they used to use to describe sort of gang activity where groups of young black men would go berserk and commit sort of crime sprees. They pick up these 5 black teenagers. They're all minors. They all are arrested. The evidence against all of them is extremely weak, but they're charged, and it's announced that they're going to go to trial. Here you see the left wing, as you would expect, campaigns on their behalf. Where's the evidence? This is not justice. They're stood outside the courthouse with placards, free the Central Park 5, etc. Who is the Central Park Five's biggest detractor? Do you know?
Who?
Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah, I know. Well, he was, even after they were exonerated, he was still saying he thought they should be executed, I think.
Yeah, he launches a massive campaign on the back of the Central Park Five.
Oh, didn't he take out ads in the Time or something?
He took out television and press adverts calling for the death penalty to be reintroduced in New York, specifically for these 5 children. They were minors who were being prosecuted for this rape. And as you say, even after they were exonerated, because years later, another man comes forward and says, I was the real rapist, and they do a DNA test, and it proves that he was the real rapist. The boys were innocent all along. They've been in jail all these years for a crime they never committed. And a lot of people felt that it was Donald Trump who had taken out all of these adverts, who had really hammered them in the press and had tainted the jury pool. And so he was kind of to blame. And he exemplified the right wing, whereas the left wing all along had been outside the courthouse. Where's the evidence? These guys are innocent. Free the Central Park Five, etc. Now you have a position where Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and the left wing claims to be outraged and disgusted by his racist rhetoric. And at the same time, they are emulating his behavior in the Central Park Five case by, on the other hand, calling for a boycott of an innocent black man's artwork because he won't apologize for a crime he didn't even commit. So you have the left wing who are behaving in the same way as the man that they consider like their antichrist. The approach to the left and the right wing has totally shifted in terms of the presumption of innocence. And we just had a case in the UK as well, where there was... so what happened was there was a guy called Jimmy Savile, and he was a TV presenter in the UK, and he was a bit of a weirdo. He sort of had this long white hair and always would have a cigar on and would have his shirt open to his navel. He was just a bit of a weirdo. And for years there have been rumours that he was a paedophile. And then he died, and right after he died, where he had this massive funeral where his coffin was taken through all the streets of the town where he lived, and there were thousands of mourners and so on, people started coming forward and saying, he abused me. And then before you knew it, there were like 400 people who'd come forward and said that he abused them. And some
400 people?
Absolutely mounds of people coming forward, telling very similar stories, that he would go to these all-girls schools and he would show up in a caravan and he'd say, do you want to be on top of the pops? I can get you tickets, but you're going to have to do me a favour. Then he'd take them in the caravan and abuse them. I don't think there's any question that he was certainly a predator of teenage girls. And what it did was it just opened this kind of crazy Pandora's box where all of a sudden everybody was being accused of historic abuse, and some of the cases proved to have merit and some of them didn't. What it's done is it's created this climate in which now everybody's being accused, and there have been a number of celebrities who've been accused who've been convicted, but there have also been a number of people who've been accused who've been acquitted. And it's all under this police operation called U-Tree. And then there was a second operation which was called Midland, Operation Midland. And it was based around the theory that at the heart of the British government there had been a paedophile ring which had been abusing and murdering children. And a number of living and a number of deceased members of Parliament were accused, one of whom was on my patch at the newspaper that I work at. His name was Harvey Proctor, and he was a former Conservative MP. He was accused in particular of murdering children in sacrificial abuse situations in front of rooms full of famous people and MPs and child witnesses. Quite fantastical accusations.
Yeah, he was a good picker when he chose the people to be in the room, that they all kept their mouths shut.
Well, exactly, yeah, and it was from the what he did. He was very brave in a sense. He called a press conference soon after he was arrested and read out at the press conference everything that he was accused of doing, and said, if you want to believe this, then, I don't know what planet you're from, basically. But he was acquitted, not even acquitted, it never even went to trial. The police cleared him, they wrote to him, apologized to him, and it turned out that the accuser was a fantasist. He changed his story multiple times. He kept changing his story to include more and more famous people. Certain parts of the story have been absolutely categorically proved fictitious. They couldn't possibly have happened. Again, what you saw was this really strange flipping of the burden of proof. So I have people on my Facebook, for instance, who would consider themselves very liberal, ranting all the time about racism and this and that, and Trump and blah,
must
blah,
be
blah,
a
right?
person or two that I know.
Oh yeah, certainly there's some crossover there. Yeah. And yet, and also Michael Jackson fans, right? So that I find very ironic. So you've got, so they're like, Michael's innocent until proven guilty, and unless you can prove he's guilty, then that's it. And then someone else is accused, and it's like, fuck them, cut their bollocks off, Yeah. So, and they totally swallowed all of this paedophile ring stuff. Totally, I knew it, these despicable politicians, that I knew they were evil.
Some of the people you might be talking about, I heard them years and years ago making really bizarre, crazy conspiratorial claims about the government even before this happened. So then these accusations come out and it plays right into their narrative that they've had for years anyway.
Exactly, and it's kind of this sort of, believing what you want to believe in a sense. But there's a guy called Peter Hitchens. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I do. He's Christopher's brother. Yep.
Yeah, so Christopher Hitchens, very famous. And he and Peter famously, basically complete polar opposites of the political spectrum. Christopher Hitchens, extremely left-wing. Peter Hitchens, extremely right-wing. And, Peter Hitchens is somebody who I would disagree with on almost everything that he says. And yet, as I look back on this Operation Midland and some of these crazy conspiracy theories that were coming out, which were demonstrably fantastical, he was the only journalist, when I look back, that I can remember who was publicly saying what has happened to the presumption of innocence. And again, you're seeing the presumption of innocence, which is traditionally something that the left wing would fight to uphold.
Right.
And the right wing would be, no, lock them up, hang the bastards, whatever. Shifting. So now, like, the most right-wing media person you could possibly think of, Peter Hitchens, is now the only person who's standing up for innocent people that have been accused falsely of crimes.
How did this switch happen?
I think it's linked in some way to political correctness. And I know that makes me sound, because political correctness is a good thing. Okay, let me go on record.
When it has...
Political correctness is a good thing. It's a good thing that you should not be able in the workplace to go up to a colleague who is of an ethnic minority and make some crazy comment about their race or, that sort of thing. Absolutely. Or you shouldn't be able to say, I don't want Fred in the toilet because he's gay. He might try and look at my knob or whatever, all that kind of stuff, right?
That's the worst. That's the worst when Fred tries to look at your knob in the toilet.
Yeah. Backs against the wall, Fred's coming in, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Right? You don't want, that's political correctness is a good thing in that sense.
Yeah.
But there's a phrase in England which is overused, admittedly, which is like political correctness gone mad.
Yeah.
And so all this stuff about, you can't, it's because there's this movement now, which is like, there is absolutely, unquestionably, a movement in both America and the UK right now from certain groups towards trying to remove the presumption of innocence. There absolutely is a movement towards that. It's even being read into Parliament at the moment, the first step towards removing the presumption of innocence. And,
are you kidding?
No, I'm not kidding.
What is that? What's the first? What are they trying to do?
It's all connected to Ched Evans. So let me go into the Ched Evans case.
Okay, please. So just to make sure I heard you clearly, because that's a radical. You're telling me that right now, as we speak, in the UK, there are steps being taken to try and erode the presumption of innocence in court?
Yeah. Now, they're not calling it the Remove the Presumption of Innocence Bill, right? But it's a first step towards removing the presumption of innocence and the right to a defense.
Disaster.
Right? So, absolutely, it's frightening. It's absolutely frightening. So what happens, there's a professional footballer called Ched Evans, and he's staying in a hotel a couple of years ago with some friends, and a woman comes back to the hotel with one of them. They've all been out drinking. They're having sex, and then Ched Evans is invited into the room and joins in. It becomes a threesome. The woman wakes up the next day, decides that a threesome is not something that she thinks she would have consented to, doesn't remember what happened because she's drunk. She was drunk at the time, and she complains to the police that she has been raped. Ched Evans and his friend both go on trial for alleged rape. She gives evidence and says she can't really remember what happened. Both of the men give evidence to say that during the time that both of them were having sex with her, she kept saying, "Fuck me harder, right? Which they say demonstrates consent, that she was a willing participant and that she wanted this to happen and that she was actively involved in the proceedings. Ched Evans' friend is acquitted and he is convicted. Now, a lot of people felt that on the evidence that was presented at trial, this was not a strong case. And a lot of people felt that this was a jury verdict, which was designed in part as a sort of a repulsed reaction to the sort of horrible lifestyle of rich professional footballers. Ched Evans had a girlfriend at the time. He was cheating on his girlfriend with this woman. They felt that he was entitled, that he was an arrogant yob, a soccer lout. Now you can't
Therefore,
get an appeal.
he's guilty.
Therefore, he's guilty. We don't like him anyway, etc. Right? That was the way a lot of people interpreted that verdict. Of course, a lot of people interpreted it as he got what he deserved. Now, what happens is when you're convicted, you can't get a new trial unless you produce new evidence, right? You have to demonstrate that there's sufficiently different evidence. You can't just say, look, the evidence that was presented, it is unreasonable that the conclusion that was reached. You have to find something new and bring it to court. But what happened was some people who were upset with the verdict and felt that it was unfair and improper, they named his accuser on the internet, which was illegal. But when that happened, there were some other men who found out her name and realized that they had slept with this woman in the same time period as this had happened. They came forward and spoke to Ched Evans' defense team, and they gave evidence to the defense team to say that they had had sex with her during this period, and when they were doing so, she had told them, fuck me harder, fuck me harder.
The same words. And they said that this went to demonstrate that when she was a coherent participant in consensual sex, this was the behavior that she would demonstrate. Ched Evans, on this basis, gets a retrial. The retrial is heard by a jury, and after this evidence is introduced, he is acquitted. The jury decides that he was innocent. He did not rape this woman. There was outcry, as you can imagine, from sort of certain people saying, you know, how dare they bring evidence into a courtroom of her sexual past, etc. Because it's relevant.
Because it's relevant, absolutely, because it's relevant. But nonetheless, you know, these sort of histrionic reactionary people.
Whenever someone argues against more evidence and more clarity on an issue, that's a big red flag.
You know, yeah, exactly. It's like, no, we don't want that evidence brought. I mean, you know, if it's directly relevant, which it was, and let's not forget, this lady is saying, I don't remember. She's saying, I don't remember giving consent. I don't remember having sex with them. She's not, you know, so she may well have done. And then you end up in this issue, I mean, it's an altogether different issue, but of, you know, whether you need to get like a signed consent form or something. You know,
can Chad Evans say, well, I don't remember giving consent either. Maybe she raped me.
Well, I mean, he could do, but, you know, as we know, men are held to a different standard in that regard, I suppose. So now, as a result of the outcry from certain factions over the fact that this lady's evidence, this lady's sexual history, evidence of that was allowed into the courtroom, an MP read into Parliament the other day the first reading of a bill which will ban defendants who are accused of rape from entering such evidence in future prosecutions, which is absolutely the first step towards the eradication of the entitlement to a fair defense and the presumption of innocence.
Is that even constitutional? Wait,
we don't have a constitution.
Yeah, you guys don't have a what the fuck am I saying? Is that even legal? Is that even going to hold up?
It would become legal. If Parliament and the House of Lords back it, it will be written into law. It will become effective. What they're trying to do is amend the Sexual Offences Bill to include this stipulation that you cannot raise evidence of a person's sexual past. So what they're effectively doing is they're using a case in which an innocent man called relevant evidence to a courtroom and was proven innocent. They're saying this must not be allowed to happen again because it's not fair to the women. And so they're trying to stop it. They're trying to stop it from happening in any future case, which is just frightening as far as I'm concerned.
Well, what are the odds they're going to be successful, do you know?
I really don't know, to be honest. I mean, we have a conservative majority, and at the moment it is the right wing which is defending the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial and the burden of proof, whereas the left wing is the ones that basically abandoning their old principles and saying just lock up anyone that at the merest suggestion they might have done something wrong. So under the current makeup of the government, it might in fact not pass, but once something like this has been set in motion, I'd be amazed if in 20 years this has not been passed.
Oh, that's so scary.
It is really frightening. I mean, it's one of several, you know, at the same time, the Conservatives are doing other things which are jeopardizing fair trials. So, for instance, they keep cutting legal aid, which restricts innocent people who are not of means in their ability to defend themselves against criminal prosecutions. They're actually, at one point, it's been repealed now because it was so unsuccessful, but they introduced a penalty where if you pleaded not guilty and then you were convicted, you would be penalized with a fine on top of your punishment, which meant basically that poor people were having to plead guilty to crimes they hadn't committed because they couldn't afford the fine if the jury didn't agree with them.
How does this fly?
You know, there's a prevailing sense of apathy in the UK nowadays, and I guess it's the same in America, where people are sick and tired of the establishment, they're sick and tired of authority, they feel that everything's a conspiracy, everything is a lie, they don't trust anything politicians say. And so when you write a story as a journalist and you say the government's doing something really bad, there's kind of this general attitude now of, well, what's new? You know, I mean, on our website where I work at this newspaper, sometimes we'll have a really fantastic, exclusive, big story about some kind of corruption, some kind of government corruption, and it will be beaten in web hits by a story about fluffy kittens.
Yeah.
Because people just, they don't, it's like, it's not news anymore. You know, the government's doing something bad, will tell us something we don't know. So, but is worrying because people need to be paying attention to this. Is you know, it's the old trope, I suppose, but you know, you can afford to ignore it when it's somebody else in the dock. But in 20 years' time, when it's you in the dock for something you didn't do, you're going to wish you were paying attention 20 years ago. People think it'll never happen to me. Well, that's what everybody thinks until they're falsely accused, and there are people who spend their whole lives in prison for things that they didn't do. Until it happens to them, they're not interested, and they watch TV and they see these cop dramas where the bad guy is always bad, and cops never get it wrong. And even if they were innocent of the thing that cops thought they did, well, it turns out they were a bastard anyway, so they deserve to get shot. It turned out he actually had someone locked up in his basement anyway, whatever. It's always this kind of almost juvenile sense of good versus evil. Very rarely do you see a cop drama which is not that clear cut. It's always the goodie versus the baddie, and you're always encouraged to side with a criminal police officer. You're always encouraged. So the police officers will go, "We've got to get this bastard any way we can." Then they'll do something they shouldn't do. They'll smash the guy's rear light so that they can search his car, or they'll go, "Oh, I think I can hear someone in his house crying for help. Can't you?" Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, smash the doors down. So you're always encouraged to side with these police officers who are breaking the law and behaving unethically, because in the portrayal that you see, the bad guy always turns out to have done it. They were always justified, when really that's not the case. And quite often what they do is, after they smash the door down, they find some way to pin something on you. In fact, I'm not going to give you any names, but there's a guy I spoke to who used to work for the Met Police, and who told me that it was absolutely routine that crime scenes would be rearranged before the crime scene photos were taken.
That's so scary.
Absolutely routine. People don't like to think that police officers and people in authority do that, but you just have to look at certain prosecutions as well, where you see that the prosecutors do things which are not fair. They exclude evidence, or they fight to exclude evidence which is exculpatory, or they hide evidence. So I'm working on something at the moment about a case where in discovery. So there's something called discovery, which is when you're charged with a crime, the prosecutors have to turn over all their evidence to the defense, so that you can examine it for anything which is exculpatory and would demonstrate that you didn't really do it. And in this case that I'm looking at, what they did was they stapled all of the exculpatory information into the middle of an irrelevant document. So they had technically handed it over, but nobody would ever find it. This kind of stuff goes on all the time. Or in the case of Kenny Waters, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Conviction.
Never seen it.
Hilary Swank film. It's based on a true story about a guy, I'm pretty sure his name was Kenny Waters, who was convicted of a murder. And he spent years in prison for this murder that it turned out he hadn't committed. And then when he finally got out, a few months after he was released, he had some terrible accident and died. So it was just a really tragic story overall. But the police, it turned out, all along had fingerprints in blood from the scene, which proved that the killer was somebody else. But because Kenny Waters they considered a local troublemaker, they withheld that evidence and decided to send him to prison for a crime that they knew all along he had not committed, just because they wanted him off the streets anyway, because they felt he was a wrong-un. They had that evidence in their possession and they held it back and didn't give it to the defense, which was illegal. And by the time it was discovered that they'd done that, the statute of limitations had expired on perjury or whatever it was they were going to charge them with, so the prosecutors faced no action whatsoever.
How can that happen where the statute of limitations will expire in a case like that, where you just don't know?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's crazy. I don't know why there is statute of limitations at all, to be honest. I mean, so in the UK, sometimes when there's a historic allegation of abuse, a judge will rule that the prosecution is an abusive process. And what that means is that the defendant has no way of defending themselves, because quite often the alleged victim can't remember a specific date. So the charge will be framed as something like this. It will say, between the dates of January 1st, 1961 and December 31st, 1961, you did commit an unlawful act upon a person under the age of 13, namely that you X, Y, Z. So on that occasion, I mean, how do you defend yourself? You've got 365 days there where you've got to somehow prove that you didn't do something. So not only is it such a wide range, but you've now got to prove a negative. If somebody says that you have not done something when you have, then you can prove that you have done it. So somebody says you've not been to the shop and brought back a pint of milk, you can produce the receipt for the pint of milk. But it's very difficult to prove that you haven't been to the shop and brought a pint of milk back to the house because you may simply have thrown the receipt away. So you can't really prove a negative. So you're facing a charge where on any day in a 365-day period, you may have committed an offence that it's impossible to prove you didn't commit. And the only evidence available to you in that case is on some fluke off chance that maybe you were out of the country for a year and you can prove it, which is unlikely because the police would find that out and change the dates on the charge. So then all you're left with is character evidence. And then you call all this character evidence, and then the prosecution says, well, of course, his friends think he wouldn't have committed the offence because he was living a double life. He's hardly likely to go down to the pub and say to his friends, oh, guess what, I've just abused a child. In that case, you have no way of putting up a defence. So it's literally somebody saying, he did abuse me, versus somebody saying, no, I didn't. And if the person who says that they were abused puts on a good enough performance, if they cry or if they look a bit vulnerable, you can go to prison on something which is really not been proven to any satisfactory standard. And so in that case, a judge will make a decision, this is an abusive process. I'm not going to allow this case to go ahead because this is not a fair trial. The person can't defend themselves. In America, they have a whole system set up which just does that by way of a time limit, which is the statute of limitations.
It seems like a lot of people have a really difficult time understanding the burden of proof. And that became apparent to me during the primaries here, because I've got lots of, leftist ideologues on my Facebook newsfeed, and it was all, burn your bust, formation betches, and like, how's that working out for you, And so they drug Hillary through the mud. And this one character in particular, he would post all these conspiratorial articles about Hillary's this, she did this, when she was a junior in high school, she poisoned the yogurt in the cafeteria, just all kinds of kooky stuff type of, And I just one day in particular, I was commenting on all these posts and I'd call them out. I'd say, this isn't a news source. Can you prove that what evidence is there that she did this? And I kid you not. And this guy's older than me. And he said to me, he goes, well, can you prove she didn't? I'm like, oh man. Oh man, but he was being totally serious. Like and I realized, like, around the time I think you turn 30, it's like, okay, well, most people my age now, they're done like learning about the world. Most people are probably going to be set more or less in their ideology now and how they view the world and their ideas. And it's like, if there are people now in their, even I'd say mid-20s, but especially 30s, 40s that don't understand why the burden of proof is not only important, but where the burden of proof rests, that's terrifying. I mean, that's terrifying that someone even older than me would suggest that I should prove that Hillary Clinton didn't do something to like prove a negative. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you where that reared its head, which is not a criminal thing, but it was with there was a posthumous, we're back to Michael Jackson again, there was a posthumous Michael Jackson album which came out, which had 3 songs on it, which did not really sound like Michael Jackson, and his family said they were fake and so on.
Yeah, I think that's because it's not him singing, from my perspective anyway.
I think that is the case as well. But this family brought these songs forward called the Cassios, who Michael had known for years, and their story was that Michael, in their basement, in their shower, had recorded either 10 or 12 songs through a tube, through a PVC pipe or something. And that's why his voice sounds weird, apparently. They don't sound like Michael Jackson. I don't know what people are doing when they say that they think those songs are him. But I remember being on Twitter and saying, well, hang on a minute, there's literally no evidence at all that Michael Jackson recorded these songs. None. No video, no photos, no outtake vocals, no handwritten lyrics, nothing. Not a single independent witness. There is nothing to connect him to these songs. And the people who were defending the estate were saying, well, what evidence have you got that they're fake?
Oh, man.
And I'm going, well, listen, I'm not the person that's coming forward and saying, hey, guys, by the way, forgot to tell you earlier, but Michael Jackson stayed in my basement. While he was here, he recorded an album in my shower. Do you want the songs? $100 million. $100 million. If I'm going to come forward with an extraordinary claim, then I need to be able to provide the evidence to demonstrate that this is true. I can't, because otherwise I could come forward and go, oh yeah, Michael, yeah, he did an album at my house as well, actually, funnily enough.
Oh yeah, just start making fraudulent tracks.
They do sound a bit weird. I'm not going to deny it. They don't really sound like him, but that's only because he recorded them in a cupboard. But, they are him, definitely him. I've got just as much evidence as the Casios, i.e. none. So $100 million, please. I mean, if we're going to operate under that system, you could bring forward an unreleased Michael Jackson album, and then your next door neighbor could be, so these people are going, oh, we'll prove they're fake. I don't have to prove they're fake because the story is so outrageous that the person who's telling the story needs to prove that it's true. And they've not done that. I think it should be on the curriculum. That's what I think. It should be taught in schools. Except
Absolutely.
my fear would be that under the current climate, that curriculum would not accurately represent what the point of the burden of proof is.
Well, where it comes up a lot with me in conversations I have with people, when I have conversations revolving around religion.
Yeah.
And I'll get asked all the time. The strangest question that you could start off with in these conversations is asking someone why they don't believe in God. Well, why should I? I always, no matter how many times I'm asked that question, I always pause and I always, I say, you do realize you're the one making the claim that God exists. So I'm more than open to it, but I need some kind of evidence to, prove he doesn't. But no, the burden of proof's on you. Okay, well, if the burden of proof is on me, then the burden of proof is therefore on the both of us to prove that Thor doesn't exist. So what evidence do you have for that? It's very, very, very strange. I don't understand why why is that difficult for people to understand the burden of proof?
I just don't know. I wonder if maybe the reason I understand it better than a lot of other people is because of my job. So as a journalist, I have to fact check everything because one mistake can land you with a massive bill or even worse, big trouble. So I really don't believe anything anyone tells me unless they can demonstrate to me that it's true. Because people do this all the time. They ring me up at work, oh, you never guess what, and
Yeah.
you're thinking, yeah, well, that's great. Can we prove it? Have you got that in writing? Oh, no, not got it in writing, no. So do you know anyone that's got it in writing? Oh, no, it's just something someone said to me over the phone. Well, I can't do anything then. I can't, you shouldn't be dumb enough to deal with this stuff over the phone. I mean, if you're in a dispute with somebody, you should be doing everything in writing. So everything I have to analyze. Can I substantiate this line of this story? Can I substantiate it? Do I have a defense if somebody's going to come at me with some kind of defamation action or, whatever? I need to be able to defend what I've written. And so, some of my friends get pissed off with me, I think, sometimes because they'll be talking to me about music-related stuff, whatever, and they go, oh, so yeah, but is that true? Well, they said it's true. Yeah, it doesn't mean shit. It doesn't mean anything. Anyone can say anything, So I analyze everything.
Isn't that crazy that's a newsflash to people in the modern era that people can and do say anything?
Exactly. Well, I had an argument once with another journalist, actually, who said to me about Michael Jackson, they said, there's no smoke without fire. That's stupid saying. I mean, whoever came up with that, what an imbecile. But anyway, there's no smoke.
And the fire is this big pile of money in a prior saying.
Right, but so I said to them, there's no smoke without fire. okay, you abused me. When I was 6 years old, you abused me. I'm going to go and tell someone right now, you abused me. By your own logic now, that means you abused me. If you're going to go, there's no smoke without fire, I can say anything about anyone, and that means it's true.
Yeah.
It's just bullshit. It's just utter bullshit. There needs to be evidence. There needs to be substantial evidence. There's no smoke without fire. It's just such an imbecilic. I just despair of it. It's critical thinking, I guess, and whatever, but it should be on the curriculum. And similarly, they should teach you about jury service and the burden of proof and the law and what to do if you're falsely accused. It should all be on the curriculum.
High school was mostly, it was total nonsense, for what I remember most of it. And I was so surprised when I got into college and I started learning things that were useful. But, the one thing that I didn't like the teacher of this class, but one class I had, we did go over logical fallacies, and I was very interested in that. And so I really, really focused a lot on that part in the class, learning about logical fallacies and stuff. And I thought, God, this is interesting. This is applicable. Like, I wish that we would learn stuff like this. And so, I mean, this seems like it's going to be important in life to figure out how to navigate life most effectively. But nope, let's, next semester, let's just go over Romeo and Juliet for the 10,000th time,
Yeah. Yeah. Endless Shakespeare. Shakespeare and algebra seem to account for about 60% of everything I did at high school. Well, one Shakespeare, that would do. If we had to learn one Shakespeare, why do I have to do like 4 Shakespeare books and 0 Hunter S. Thompson?
Boy, that'd be rich. Hunter S. Thompson in high school, especially back in Oregon when everyone's coming to class stoned already. That'd be terrific.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Peace, love, and happiness. Well, I guess to wrap up this podcast, I think it's important to note that, again, just for anyone who may have listened, Charlie and I take sexual assault extremely seriously. The reason that it was so important to talk about the burden of proof is because, as we're seeing, like Charlie talked about in the UK with legislation that's been recently introduced, and how I've heard people talk about it in the States, for some reason the presumption of innocence is not being valued like it used to be. Like people, or at least like Charlie said, the political sides have somehow flipped and flopped on this. And the presumption of innocence is really important. So that's why we had to, talk about some cases, some high profile cases and cases that Charlie's personally sat in on, back, in the UK, where, we're trying to illustrate that, yes, there are victims. We all know that there are real victims, but there are cases where people, for malicious reasons or because they're scared they're going to get in trouble, in the case of the teenage boy that Charlie brought up, where people lie, and they lie about really, 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 really serious crimes. And that's why it's really, really important, especially, and also say nothing of the integrity of the system. The presumption of innocence is very, very, very important. It's not, we don't have a just system if we determine that people are guilty just on someone's say so. Like, evidence is really, really crucial. And just think about it. Think about if it was you. Would you want to be accused of something and just automatically everyone thinks you're a rapist or thinks you're whatever and you just get thrown in the slammer? I mean, that does happen sometimes. So, what could we possibly say other than what we've talked about already that would get people to start caring and start valuing the ideal that you are innocent until proven guilty, and we're not going to take away life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness unless we can demonstrate that you're a danger to society? What else could we say?
Well, I mean, it's just all I would say is that there is a tendency on both sides to sort of suggest that it's an either-or situation, that you're either in the camp which is on the side of women who have been abused, or you're in the camp on the side of the presumption of innocence. And there's no reason you can't be on both sides,
Right.
There's no reason you shan't. I mean, everybody should be absolutely concerned with women or children who say they've been abused, or men, because there are cases where men are sexually assaulted by other men or by women. And absolutely, those people who have been victimized deserve our outrage and our support. But equally, somebody who has been falsely accused, who has had their life destroyed, also deserves our outrage and our support. And the way that it's framed by certain sort of extreme groups and by certain factions of the media is that by being on the side of somebody who's been falsely accused, you're somehow betraying those who have been genuinely victimized. And I'll give you an example, just to close. There's a lady who got famous in the UK quite some years ago, about 10 years ago. Her name was Jade Goody, and she went on the British version of Big Brother. She became very famous as this kind of chavvy. Chavvy means sort of common, I guess. You know, she was gobby and she was a loud mouth, and she was famous for being a bit dim. Didn't know what the capital of England was and stuff. And when she came out, she got together with this guy whose name I think was Jack Tweed or Jack Tweedy, and he later split from her and then was accused of raping a woman, and he stood trial and he was acquitted. And the next day on the TV, on one of the breakfast shows, I guess like our version of what in America would be like Good Morning America or something, in the UK it's called This Morning, there was a lady on there who was from a victims advocate group or something along those lines, a very stern-faced woman, and she was on television saying that it was irresponsible of the media to report on the fact that this man had been acquitted and was falsely accused.
Why? Because
it would deter women who had been abused from coming forward.
Why would it deter women who'd been abused from coming forward?
Exactly. And so what she's saying there is that an innocent man is less deserving of our outrage and support than a victimized woman. And I don't believe that. I believe if you are falsely accused, then you have the right, having had your name smeared, you have the right to have it restored. And it just seems a very extremist attitude to me to say that we should allow people to go on believing that an innocent man is guilty rather than deter genuine victims. And also it demonstrates, in my opinion, a kind of a very dim attitude that this lady seems to have towards women. Like, women are all so dumb that they think that because one man has been acquitted because he was falsely accused, that means they can't report what's happened to them. I mean, you're not giving women much credit when you make a statement like that. You're treating them like imbeciles.
What's her motivation in doing that? Does she really believe it? Or?
I don't know. I can't personally conceive of that mindset. I can't understand why anybody would think that, or, where they're coming from. It just seems to me like craziness. But it's a craziness which is sweeping across the whole of society to the point where I have friends on social media who I would consider, who they would consider themselves very liberal, and yet who will immediately assume that anybody who is falsely accused is guilty, and yet who in many cases, due to my own social circle, will be absolutely devout Michael Jackson fans on Facebook ranting that because somebody's been accused of something, it means they're guilty. And it just boggles the mind.
And it's especially ironic because, as you, I'm firmly in the camp that Michael Jackson didn't do it. I think it's relatively obvious, especially to anyone who is well read on the trial. But at the same time, I could understand why people thought he did. I never sat around thinking like, boy, this is weird. I can't figure out why people think he did it, because
his behavior was nutty, and a lot of people were going to draw inferences from his behavior. Absolutely. It was when you looked at the evidence. See, that was an attitude. A lot of people said the only reason you think he's innocent is because he's Michael Jackson. And I would say, no, the only reason you think he's guilty is because he's Michael Jackson. Yeah. If you look at the evidence, if you remove the name Michael Jackson from the case, and you look purely at the credibility of the witnesses, the evidence in favour, and the evidence against, there is no question that this man deserved a complete sweep of not guilty verdicts. The evidence was not there, and the evidence that it didn't happen was monumental.
In cases where, like the friends that you were talking about, where they'll defend Michael Jackson, anyone else, just at the first accusation, there's guilt. That seems odd. It was a hard sell when I had to explain to people about the trial, or when it would come up. I'd be like, "Okay, I understand. There's a lot of groundwork to do here because I understand this person's gotten all their information from a really biased media. Yeah, he's as Bill Maher once said, an unorthodox babysitter. Like really."
Yeah.
There's some explaining to do for sure. But you would think that fans of his who've had those same conversations, or people who know the trial well, would be sympathetic to innocent until proven guilty, even if it looks bad, let alone when it just looks neutral or you don't know.
Yeah, that's kind of the craziness of it. And it sort of demonstrates the change in attitude in the last sort of 12 years.
Do you have any idea why?
I think it's media. I think it's apathy about abuses by the authority, by the establishment. I think people 10 years ago were still a lot more upset by the idea of corruption than they are today. And, as I say, we sometimes run stories which are big stories, big exclusive stories about government wrongdoing, mistreatment of innocent working people, etc. And it just seems to have very limited impact. There just seems to be little appetite now for any kind of expose of governmental wrongdoing. And so people, I just think, are a lot less concerned by the idea of conspiracy or prosecutorial misconduct than they were back then. Just in my experience, in my day-to-day working life, that's my impression. They kind of have lost interest in trying to preserve or uphold or forge any kind of change to the system. It's almost like a let it burn attitude.
Some of the people, it's almost like they think they are changing the system by posting about it on their Facebook echo chamber.
That's also true. That's definitely also true. There's a massive drop-off in direct action. So whereas people used to take to the streets to protest, they now take to Facebook, which is absolutely, completely and utterly fucking pointless. I just want to say that, totally pointless. You're wasting your time.
I couldn't believe all the people during the primary that were posting these masturbatory blog posts about Queen Bey, Beyonce, like trying to insinuate she's some brilliant political mind, and by liking and sharing these ridiculous posts in their own echo chamber, they're going to somehow influence the outcome of the primaries. I was just like, what in the world do you think you're doing?
There was an instance that just struck me recently. So when I was a kid, in America, did you have lollipop people to help you cross the road?
Lollipop people?
So it's like a person with a big stick, and they walk out into the road and stop the traffic so children can cross.
Oh, yeah, cross guards?
Do you have that? Cross guards, right. We call them lollipop ladies or whatever. When I was a kid at my school, there were government cuts, and they tried to get rid of the lollipop lady. And we all organized a march, hundreds and hundreds of people, parents and teachers and kids. And we marched from the school down to the local government, sort of city hall type building, and the police station, with all banners and chanting. And we managed to get the lollipop lady reinstated. There was just a story recently in my area where there was some irritation over a lollipop person, and the parent set up an internet petition. And I just thought, what are you doing? What are you doing? That's going to do nothing. That's going to do absolutely nothing. People feel like they're contributing at the click of a button, but they're not. They might as well be doing nothing.
And I think it just irritates them more when they realize that, no, I've been liking and sharing on Facebook for the last 8 years, and it doesn't seem to have improved anything. Boy, now I'm really pissed. It must be someone else's fault. Why aren't you changing? you resemble groups in the past that have been an oppressor. It's somehow your fault. Shame on you. It's like, okay, well, another 8 years.
There's nothing wrong with sharing your political opinions on social media, but it's just not the way to affect change or large-scale change. The way to affect change is by protest, proper, direct action. There was a film that I saw a couple of years ago all about the history of ACT UP, which was the AIDS protest group. I think it was called United in Anger, the history of ACT UP, something like that. It's so worth seeing if you're able to track a copy down. It's about how they organized and they got together, and they were strategic, and it took them a long time, but they achieved massive change. And it's one of the most moving, phenomenal films I've ever seen. And it's well worth tracking down. And while I'm thinking of that, on the subject of the presumption of innocence, there's a couple of films that I would say that people really who are interested, they must watch, which is The Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, the Central Park Five, Capturing the Freedmans, West of Memphis, and if they can get it, the Jean-Xavier Lestrade TV series called The Staircase about the Michael Peterson trial. For a start, those are the ones that I would direct people towards, because these documentaries will tell you absolutely why we need a burden of proof and a presumption of innocence.
I don't know if you saw Making a Murder. That's the one that a lot of Americans had seen more recently.
Yeah, I saw it.
What'd you think about that?
I think Stephen Avery probably did it. Certainly from reading around the TV show, there seems to be a fair amount of evidence that was found that they never mentioned. But I do think that there was some prosecutorial and police misconduct there for sure. And I think what they've done is by behaving improperly, they've given the lie to the fact. They've enabled people who want to accuse them of going after the wrong person.
What about the kid? The kind of
Brendan Dassey?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that video of his interview session with the lawyer's investigator was just horrendous.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrendous. I mean, I understand he's just been released, actually. I think he's just been released. I don't know what to think about Brendan Dassey. But, certainly I think the way he was treated was improper. This is the point. Whether, that could be an innocent person. I don't know whether Brendan Dassey's innocent or guilty, but I think it would be hard for anybody to watch that tape, the way he was treated by that investigator, the way he was cajoled and manipulated, and say that that's just, or that the result of that was justice. And that is commonplace. This is what I'm saying. It's absolutely commonplace. They do it to guilty people and they do it to innocent people. And that is why we need a stringent burden of proof and presumption of innocence, because sometimes they get it wrong.
One more question to ask you, just because I'm curious. I don't know if I've ever asked you. OJ.
Oh, there's no question that he was guilty. But again, the police, they tainted themselves.
Yeah, Mark Furman.
What the fuck is that all about? I mean, that guy should not have been on the force. And so they kind of brought it on themselves in a sense.
He was the only one from that whole trial to have to be convicted of criminal charges, perjured himself,
Yeah, good. And he should have been convicted. Yeah. But now he's like a media darling. Now he appears on Fox News all the time I think he's actually a Fox News correspondent, isn't he?
Well, he's right up their alley.
Pundit or something. Yeah, I mean, that's just horrendous, But, I mean, the DNA in the OJ case is pretty compelling, to be honest. But at the time, DNA was relatively new, and it was easy to bamboozle the jurors, I think.
I thought they couldn't use the DNA because the police didn't go through due process, so they couldn't present it.
I think you might be right, actually. Certainly it was raised during the defense case that the DNA was tainted. I don't know whether that's the case or not. But yeah, they attacked the DNA big time, and it worked.
See, people always say that the OJ defense was just playing the race card, but it wasn't. It was about much more than that. And, if playing the race card is exposing a Nazi at the heart of the LAPD, then fucking play it.
Yeah.
Fuck him.
Yeah.
So, that's not playing the race card, that's doing a public service.
Yeah, I'm with you. Well, sounds good. Is there any final takeaway that people should take with them after listening to this podcast?
I don't know. I would say just watch those films that I mentioned. They will be a great starting point for understanding these, why this is so important.
What's your favorite one out of those?
West of Memphis.
West of Memphis.
Say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for talking with me today. You've been a great friend for many, many years. This has been, I think, a really important episode of the podcast. I mean, we're talking about people's livelihoods here, and there's a few things more important than a situation where someone may be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, regardless of the country. Are there any final words, Mr. Award-winning British journalist Charles Thomson?
Just thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And maybe sometime, I know we talked about him a lot, but maybe sometime it would be good to go through and do a podcast all about the Michael Jackson trial.
Yeah, I'd be in.
Sounds good. And don't forget, and as you said in the beginning, at this point, you've been mentioned in many books, I think, about his life and everything. And it occurred to me, don't forget, in one of those, I mentioned along with you.
Which one is that? Is that Life of a Legend?
No, it's the first book of Michael.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that one. Yeah, you're right.
All right. Well, thank you again. And one tiny anecdote, I can say that, over the years, people will, I've had friends when they pay me compliments, it'll be about, being able to maybe talk through different issues with them and reason through this and reason through that. And that tends to be what type of compliment I'm paid when I've been useful in a friendship. And I can say that if I look back over all the years, probably Charlie more so than anyone, thanks to years of communicating and sparring over different issues, I can really look back and see how it really helped tone my ability to think critically and really think carefully about issues. And I can say too that now looking back, I've probably come closer to your positions on things than I originally was where I started with my own. So you've been invaluable in my own life as well. So thank you very much. And let's talk again soon sometime.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you. I am on Twitter at ReasonBound. Charlie, do you have anywhere that you want to direct people if they want to contact you?
Yeah, they can contact me through my website, which is www.charles-thomson.net, or they can follow me on Twitter at CE Thomson.
And I think it might be important to point out your last name is spelled Thomson.
Yes, no P.
No P. All right, well, thank you very, very much, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.